Before hoodoo was something talked about on TikTok, before somebody called it witchcraft, and way before you could order spiritual supplies off the internet, there were African people carrying generations of spiritual knowledge. And when enslaved Africans were brought to America, they couldn't pack up their temples, their communities, or everything they had back at home. But there was one thing nobody could completely take from them: what they knew. Today, we're getting into African roots of hoodoo and how those traditions survived in America. One of the first things we have to understand is that hoodoo wasn't created out of nowhere. The African people brought to North America came from different regions, ethnic groups, and cultures. That meant they brought different knowledge systems with them. Knowledge surrounding plants, ancestors, healing, protection, divination, spiritual forces, and the natural world. Once these people were forced into completely different circumstances in America, those traditions couldn't necessarily continue exactly as they had before. They had to adapt, and that's important because hoodoo developed in the United States, but many of the ideas that contributed to it had African foundations. So when we talk about hoodoo's African roots, we're talking about cultural knowledge that survived an enormous disruption. Now, imagine being taken somewhere where your language, family structure, and religious practices are deliberately disrupted. How do traditions survive under those conditions? They change. People preserve what they can. They exchange knowledge. They learn from other people. And traditions that may have once existed separately begin influencing one another. That's part of what happened in America. African-derived practices encountered Native American knowledge, particularly surrounding local plants and the environment, as well as European folk traditions and Christianity. Over generations, these influences contributed to what became various forms of Conjure, Rootwork, and Hoodoo. That's why Hoodoo shouldn't be presented as perfectly preserved copy of one African religion. It developed under uniquely African American historical circumstances. And this is where some people get confused, because they'll say, wait, if Hoodoo has African roots, why do I keep seeing the Bible? Because traditions adapt. Christianity became deeply intertwined with African American life, including under conditions where Christianity was imposed under enslaved people. But African Americans also interpret and use biblical material through their own cultural experiences. Think about the symbolism. Moses, a man leading enslaved people towards freedom. Exodus, deliverance from bondage. Psalms, words that could be prayed for protection, justice, healing, or deliverance. So the presence of Christianity doesn't automatically erase Hoodoo's African heritage. It helps us understand how a tradition could adapt to the religious environment surrounding the people practicing it. Now, let's talk about why it's called rootwork. Roots, herbs, and other natural materials became important components of many hoodoo practices. But there's an important distinction here. Rootwork doesn't simply mean herbal medicine. Historically, a root could refer to more than a literal plant. Depending on context and region, spiritual objects, charms, and prepared items could also be involved. And practitioners themselves went by different names. You may encounter terms like root worker, conjure doctor, conjure man, conjure woman, root doctor. Different regions develop their own terminology. And historically, These practitioners could occupy important positions within their communities. People might seek them for protection, healing, divination, good fortune, or assist with personal problems. Now, this stereotype needs to go, because when popular culture shows hoodoo, what do they usually show? Somebody getting cursed, a creepy doll, somebody doing something evil in the middle of the night. But historically, hoodoo encompasses much more than harmful workings. The material you're studying describes practitioners serving several major purposes, including protection, healing, divination, or diagnosis, attracting good fortune, and retribution. So somebody could seek spiritual assistance because they believe something was wrong. But they could also seek help because they wanted protection, prosperity, or healing. That's a much bigger picture than somebody putting a hex on you. Here's probably the biggest takeaway from this. Survival requires adaptation. The traditions brought by African people encounter a completely different environment in America. Different plants, different communities, different laws, different religions, different social conditions, and generations of Black Americans continue adapting those practices. That's one reason hoodoo can vary geographically. What somebody practiced in the Carolinas may not look identical to traditions documented in Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia, or Louisiana. There wasn't one giant hoodoo headquarters handing everybody the same instruction manual. Knowledge often traveled through families, communities, oral traditions, and relationships between experienced practitioners and learners. And this is where I want to leave you. When hoodoo gets reduced to spells and anesthetics, we lose the most important part of the story: the people. This tradition developed within African American communities living through slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, segregation, and generations of social change. So studying hoodoo isn't just studying magic. You're studying African American history, folklore, spirituality, survival, and cultural adaptation. Some practices change. Some merged with other influences. Some disappeared. Others survived. But the knowledge wasn't simply erased. And that is why understanding the African roots has to come before jumping straight into spells. So, now that we've talked about where hoodoo's African foundations come from, we're ready to go deeper. Because knowing where hoodoo came from is one thing. Understanding how hoodoo actually works as a spiritual system is another. And that's exactly where we're going next. Stay tuned for the next episode.